Ruth, a Sunday school teacher, was admired by everyone in the small village where she lived for her dedication to her faith and her community. Yet, at home, she faced a silent struggle, the loss of connection with her teenage daughter, Esther. Feeling constantly overlooked by her mother, Esther began to rebel, drifting away from the church and the traditions Ruth held so dear. One night, after a heated argument, Ruth was overwhelmed by a deep anguish that made her question her priorities. That same night, she had a haunting dream. She wandered alone through a foggy field, hearing Esther's cries in the distance but unable to find her. When she woke up, Ruth felt that the dream might have been a divine warning. Determined to win back her daughter's heart and restore peace at home, Ruth embarks on a spiritual journey that forces her to revisit her faith, confront her fears, and truly understand the meaning of unconditional love. But will this transformation be enough to save Esther before it's too late? Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us until the end because this story might surprise you in ways you never expected. The untaught lesson. It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon, and the village seemed wrapped in a unique calm. Ruth had just finished teaching another class at Sunday school, surrounded by children who admired her deeply. She was a woman of unshakable faith, known for her ability to bring Bible teachings to life. However, as she stepped into her home, the serene expression she wore at church disappeared. Esther, her 15-year-old daughter, was sitting on the couch with headphones on, her face lit by the glow of her phone screen. The mess around her was undeniable: books scattered on the floor, dirty dishes in the sink, and, most irritating to Ruth, a pile of unfolded laundry. "Esther, how many times have I told you about this mess?" Ruth's voice sliced through the silence, heavy with frustration. Esther didn't even look up. Ruth walked over and pulled one of her daughter's headphones off. "Are you listening to me? I work myself to the bone, and you don't lift a finger to help. Is this what you've learned from me?" Esther stood abruptly, her face filled with hurt. "Maybe it's because you're never here to teach me anything." Esther shot back before storming out, slamming the door behind her. Ruth stood frozen, the weight of her daughter's words hitting her like a blow. For months, she had noticed Esther pulling away but had always chalked it up to teenage rebellion. Never, until that moment, had she considered that the problem might lie within herself. That night, while washing dishes alone, Ruth found herself wondering how often she had placed her mission at church above her own family. She loved Esther deeply, but when was the last time she told her that? When was the last time they had prayed together or shared a peaceful moment? The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. Ruth felt lost. With a heavy sigh, she decided to head to bed, seeking comfort in the scriptures before falling asleep. But little did she know, that night would bring far more than comfort. The call in the fog. The night was cold, and Ruth fell asleep with her Bible beside her, the words of Psalm 127 echoing in her mind, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." Though she tried to rest her soul in those promises, unease lingered, hovering over her like a shadow. Soon, her sleep was overtaken by a strange and unsettling dream. She found herself walking through a field shrouded in thick fog, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The sky above was gray, and an eerie silence enveloped everything around her. Ruth's heart raced as if something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, a sound pierced the air. It was crying, but not just any crying. It was Esther's voice. "Mom," the call was sharp, desperate, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Why can't you see me? Why don't you hear me?" Ruth tried to run, but the ground seemed to swallow her feet. Each step was harder than the last, the earth pulling her down. She shouted Esther's name, but the fog smothered her voice. Gradually, shadows began to form around her, vague figures with eyes that glowed with disapproval. Whispers swirled around her. "You lost her, just as you lost your way." "No!" Ruth screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I love my daughter. I never wanted to lose her." The voices stopped, and a light appeared in the distance. Driven by desperation, Ruth ran toward it. The closer she got, the more the scene around her began to change. The fog started to lift, revealing a sight that froze her in place. Esther stood on a fragile bridge swaying above a violent river. She looked terrified, her tear-streaked face turned toward Ruth. "Mom, catch me," the girl pleaded, reaching out her hand. Ruth tried to reach for her, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. "Esther, I'm here. Don't move." Ruth begged, but the bridge began to give way. Before she could react, the ground beneath Esther's feet crumbled, and she disappeared into the dark waters below. Ruth's scream echoed into the void, and she jolted awake, drenched in sweat and trembling. The clock on the bedside table read 3 a.m. Clutching her Bible to her chest, her heart pounding, Ruth whispered to herself, this wasn't just a dream, it was a call. A warning. Looking around, she felt an eerie emptiness in the house. On impulse, she decided to check Esther's room, something she rarely did in the middle of the night. When she opened the door, she saw the bed was empty. Her heart stopped. Flicking on the light, Ruth scanned the room, hoping to find Esther somewhere, but the room was deserted. There was no sign of her daughter. Ruth ran through the house, calling for Esther, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. Grabbing her phone, she tried calling, but the call went straight to voicemail. Each passing moment deepened her panic. Had she run away? Had something happened to her? Overcome with despair, Ruth fell to her knees in the living room and prayed like never before. Through her tears, she pleaded with God to show her the way. Then, a gentle breeze swept through the room, as if someone had opened a window. Ruth felt a sudden, inexplicable calm, and a phrase echoed in her mind, like a whisper. "Look where her heart finds rest." Ruth opened her eyes, puzzled. What could that mean? Where could Esther be? Standing up, she felt a newfound determination to follow the cryptic message. She didn't know where to start, but her heart told her she was about to uncover something that would change everything. Where had Esther gone, and what did that mysterious message mean? Ruth was about to embark on a journey that could either bring them closer together or tear them apart for good. The place of the heart. Ruth hurriedly threw on her coat and stepped into the night. The early hours were cold and quiet, and the village seemed transformed under the pale glow of the moon. As she walked, her whispered prayers were a mix of pleading and regret. Lord, I know I've failed as a mother. But please, show me the way to Esther. Don't let her be alone. Don't leave me alone. The phrase she had heard in her prayer earlier continued to echo in her mind, the place where her heart rests. Ruth couldn't ignore the message. But where would Esther's heart have taken her? Where did she find solace? Suddenly, the answer struck her like lightning. The grove by the church. It had been Esther's favorite place since she was a child. Whenever something troubled her, she would retreat there, claiming the birdsong and the gentle breeze made her feel closer to God. Ruth quickened her pace, her steps fueled by a blend of hope and anxiety. When she reached the grove, she hesitated. The darkness was thick, and the twisted branches of the trees looked like outstretched hands trying to grasp her. But Ruth pressed on, driven by urgency. As she neared the heart of the grove, a sound reached her ears. A faint noise, like muffled sobbing. "Esther?" Ruth called, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, are you here?" Silence answered her, but Ruth refused to give up. She kept walking until, suddenly, she saw a figure sitting on the trunk of a fallen tree. Esther's hair glimmered in the moonlight, but her body was hunched over, her face buried in her hands. "Esther!" Ruth cried out, rushing to her. The girl looked up, and Ruth's heart broke at the sight of tears streaming down her daughter's face. Esther looked so fragile, so vulnerable, that Ruth struggled to find her voice. "What are you doing here alone?" Ruth asked, her voice cracking. "Do you know how scared I was?" Esther didn't reply immediately. At last, she stood, her eyes locking with her mother's. "You wouldn't even notice if I didn't disappear," she said, her voice raw with pain. "Sometimes, I feel like I don't matter to you. Like you care more about the kids at church than you do about me." The words struck Ruth like a dagger. Was this what Esther had been carrying in her heart? All the hurt and insecurity Ruth had unknowingly fostered? "Sweetheart, forgive me," Ruth began, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "I never wanted you to feel that way. I've been so focused on doing God's work that I forgot, you are my work. You are the greatest blessing He has given me." Esther lowered her gaze, biting her lip as though holding back more tears. "Then why don't you ever tell me that?" she asked. "Why are you never there for me? I just wanted you to see me." Ruth pulled Esther into a tight embrace, and this time, the girl didn't resist. For the first time in years, Ruth let her own tears flow freely. "I see you, Esther. I see now how much I've gotten wrong. But I promise, that's going to change. You're the most important person in my life, and I'll make sure you never doubt that again." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, as the gentle breeze of the grove seemed to envelop them both. Ruth knew this was only the beginning of her journey to rebuild her relationship with Esther, but she felt fortified by faith that with God's help, she could mend the bond with her daughter. After a long silence, Esther finally spoke. "Do you think God still hears me, Mom? Even after everything?" Ruth cupped her daughter's face, smiling tenderly. "Sweetheart, He's never stopped listening. And neither will I." The two walked out of the grove together, Ruth's heart brimming with gratitude for the chance to start anew. But as they made their way back home, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the troubling dream still held a deeper lesson, one she would need to uncover to complete her transformation. While Ruth and Esther had taken their first steps toward reconciliation, was Ruth truly prepared for the challenges that lay ahead? And what other message might the mysterious dream yet reveal? Revelations in the stillness. Dawn arrived with a sense of renewal. For the first time in a long while, Ruth woke up feeling lighter. Esther was still asleep, and Ruth took advantage of the silence to kneel by her bed. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her eyes closed. "Thank you for giving me another chance. I know there's still much to do, but I trust you are with me." She remained in quiet prayer until she heard footsteps in the hallway. Esther appeared in the doorway, her hair messy, her expression a mix of shyness and curiosity. "Mom, are you praying?" Esther asked, tilting her head. Ruth smiled and nodded. "Yes. And you're part of my prayer." Esther stepped into the room and sat beside her mother. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then, Esther broke the silence. "I dreamed about Dad." Ruth froze, surprised. It had been years since Esther had mentioned her father, who had passed away in an accident when she was just a child. "You did?" Ruth asked gently, studying her daughter's face. Esther nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and tenderness. "In the dream, he told me he was proud of me. But he also said there was something you needed to hear." Esther hesitated, her voice faltering. "What was it?" Ruth prompted, her heart racing. "He said you need to learn to truly trust God. That sometimes, you try to handle everything on your own and forget that God is always willing to carry the burden with you." Esther's words struck Ruth deeply. She knew her daughter couldn't have made that up. It was a truth Ruth had been avoiding for a long time. She had taken on the responsibility of saving and guiding everyone, forgetting that God was the ultimate author and sustainer of all things. "He was right," Ruth admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been trying so hard to fix everything my way, but I'm ready to change, Esther. I want us to learn together how to trust him." Esther smiled softly, and Ruth felt her heart warm. It was as if a bridge was being rebuilt between them, one she knew was crafted by God's hand. Later, as Esther tidied her room, Ruth decided to revisit the passage from Psalm 127 that had stayed with her the previous night. When she opened her Bible, a folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages. Curious, Ruth picked it up and realized it was a letter from her late husband, written shortly before his death. Her heart raced, she didn't remember ever seeing it before. The letter read, "Ruth, if you're reading this, I want you to know how much I've always admired your strength and dedication. But remember, my love, not everything depends on you. God is always with us, even in the toughest storms. Trust in him and in the love he's given us for our family. Love Esther for me, and never let her doubt how precious she is." The tears came without warning. Ruth clutched the letter to her chest, feeling God's presence, and her husband's, beside her. This was no coincidence. It was a divine reminder that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. Esther appeared in the doorway again, noticing her mother's tears. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ruth wiped her eyes and smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart. For the first time in a long while, I'm truly fine." She showed the letter to Esther, and the two read it together, wrapped in each other's arms as the morning sun streamed through the window, filling the room with light. Ruth knew the road to rebuilding her family would still be long, but now she had something she hadn't had before, complete trust in God and the certainty that, with him, nothing was impossible. As Ruth and Esther take significant steps toward reconciliation, new challenges loom on the horizon, ready to test their faith and commitment. Will their renewed bond and trust in God be enough to weather the storms ahead? Trials in the storm. The weeks that followed brought a noticeable change in Ruth and Esther's relationship. There were more conversations, more laughter, and above all, more understanding. Ruth intentionally made time for her daughter, and Esther slowly began to open up. However, blessings rarely come without challenges, and soon, a storm loomed on the horizon. One ordinary afternoon, Ruth received an unexpected call from Esther's school. The principal, his voice tense, asked Ruth to come to the school immediately. Ruth's heart raced. Something inside her told her this wasn't a routine visit. Upon arrival, she was led to a small office where Esther sat with her head down beside the principal. Ruth's eyes met her daughter's, and she saw a mix of fear and shame in Esther's gaze. "What's going on?" Ruth asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The principal sighed before responding. "Mrs. Ruth, we found Esther involved in a serious incident." She was caught with a group of students vandalizing the school walls. Additionally, during the confrontation, it was discovered that some of these students were in possession of alcohol. Ruth was speechless. She looked at Esther, who couldn't bring herself to lift her head. "Esther, is this true?" Ruth asked, her voice low but filled with concern. Esther hesitated before responding, tears welling in her eyes. "I wasn't drinking, Mom. I was just with them. They're my friends." Ruth felt the weight of the situation. She understood that Esther was in a delicate phase, searching for acceptance and trying to figure out who she was. But this quest was leading her down a dangerous path. "Thank you for letting me know, Principal," Ruth said. "I'll handle this at home. I assure you Esther will understand the seriousness of what happened." The ride home was steeped in silence. Ruth wanted to explode, to yell, but she remembered her commitment to be more patient and loving. She knew this was a crucial moment, and how she handled it could shape their relationship moving forward. When they got home, Ruth asked Esther to sit on the couch. "Esther, I need you to explain this to me. Why were you with that group? You know this isn't what God wants for you." Esther began to cry, finally releasing the emotions she had been holding back. "I feel so alone, Mom. I thought if I joined their group, they'd like me. I didn't know how to leave without them laughing at me." Esther's words pierced Ruth's heart. Despite her recent efforts, Esther still carried deep insecurities. "Sweetheart, you don't need to change who you are to make anyone like you," Ruth said, holding her daughter's hands. "God made you perfect, exactly as you are. You are loved by Him, by me, and by the world He created for you. But you must remember, the choices we make have consequences." Esther nodded, sobbing. "I just want to be accepted, Mom." Ruth embraced Esther tightly, letting her cry until exhaustion took over. That night, after Esther had fallen asleep, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her Bible open. Once again, she sought strength in Scripture to understand how to guide her daughter through so many external influences. She turned to Proverbs 22 verse 6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it." Ruth realized she needed to do more than just love Esther. She needed to help her daughter understand who she was in God's eyes. It was time to strengthen both her own faith and Esther's as never before. But as she reflected, Ruth felt the storm had not yet fully passed. Something told her this was only the beginning of a larger spiritual battle, one that would test everything they were building together. Esther was starting to grasp how her search for acceptance had been leading her away from her true self, but the external pressures wouldn't vanish overnight. Ruth, too, would face an even greater test of faith and leadership. What lay ahead for this mother and daughter? Would they have the strength to face the trials awaiting them on their journey of faith, love, and redemption? The invisible storm. The next morning brought with it a heavy stillness. Ruth felt a strange unease hanging over her home, a tension she couldn't quite name. Despite the recent incident at school, Esther seemed calmer, as though the relief of confessing her feelings had granted her a small measure of peace. But Ruth knew that deep wounds didn't heal overnight. That afternoon, while Esther worked on her homework, Ruth decided to visit Pastor Elias, a wise and seasoned spiritual guide who had supported the community for years with his counsel. Seated in his modest office, Ruth poured out her concerns. "Pastor, I feel like I'm fighting something I can't see," she admitted, her eyes brimming with tears. "Esther is trying to change, but it feels like there are forces pulling her back into a world I don't want her to know. And honestly, I'm so tired. It feels like my prayers just aren't enough." Pastor Elias listened patiently, his calm presence steadying Ruth. Finally, he spoke, his voice both gentle and firm. "Ruth, you're in the midst of a spiritual battle. When we choose to draw closer to God and lead our families in His ways, it's natural for the enemy to try to discourage us. But remember, the Lord has not left you alone. Your role is to persevere in faith and, above all, to show Esther that God's love is greater than any influence the world can offer." "But how do I do that, Pastor? Sometimes I feel like words just aren't enough." The pastor smiled kindly. "Words are important, but actions are even more powerful. Be the mother Esther needs to see, a reflection of Christ's patience, courage, and love. And never forget that you're not fighting this battle alone. God is your strength." Ruth left the pastor's office with renewed resolve. She knew she couldn't rush Esther's transformation, but she could be a steady anchor for her daughter as they weathered this storm together. That evening, Ruth invited Esther to join her for a special moment of prayer. At first, Esther seemed hesitant, but eventually, she agreed. Sitting together on the sofa, their hands intertwined, Ruth began to pray aloud. "Lord, thank you for this family and for the chance to start anew. Help us find your light in our darkest moments and give us strength in the face of temptation. Protect Esther and guide her steps, showing her how deeply she is loved and valued by you." As Ruth prayed, Esther began to cry quietly. When her mother finished, the girl wrapped her arms around her, whispering, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me." Ruth held her tightly, her heart swelling with hope. But deep in her soul, she sensed that the storm wasn't over. The next morning at school, Esther was met with stares and whispers. The same friends she had once spent time with now avoided her, exchanging mocking laughter and cruel comments. "So, you're a saint now, Esther," one girl taunted. "Did your mom give you a sermon?" Esther tried to ignore them, but the words stung like arrows. The pain of rejection was a heavy burden she didn't know how to bear. During lunch, she sat alone in the courtyard, clutching her tray and fighting back tears. Back at home, Ruth immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What's going on, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting beside Esther on the sofa. The girl hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want to be my friends anymore, Mom. They said I've changed, that I'm not fun like I used to be." Ruth took a deep breath, her heart aching for her daughter. She wanted to shield Esther from every hurt, but she knew she couldn't protect her from all of life's challenges. "Sweetheart, being different isn't a bad thing," Ruth said gently. "In fact, sometimes it's exactly what God calls us to be. He sets us apart for something greater, something we may not fully understand yet. I know it hurts right now, but trust that He has a purpose for you." Esther nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in her eyes. Ruth knew it would take time for her daughter to embrace that truth fully. As Esther struggled to find herself amidst the pressures of her peers, Ruth realized she wasn't just battling external influences. She was also contending with the internal doubts and insecurities her daughter carried. Would Esther be able to discover her true identity before being pulled back into the shadows? And could Ruth maintain the faith and strength needed to guide her through the invisible storm threatening to consume them both? The value of truth. In the days that followed, Esther remained shrouded in a cloud of insecurity. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, but the isolation she felt at school made each day feel like another test of endurance. Ruth, on her part, intensified her efforts to strengthen her daughter. They spent more time together studying scripture, cooking, and even reviving old habits, like taking walks through the grove Esther had always loved. One evening, as they washed dishes after dinner, Ruth noticed Esther fidgeting, her eyes fixed on the swirling water. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" Ruth asked gently. Esther hesitated before speaking. "Mom, I wish I had your courage," she murmured. "You talk about trusting God, but sometimes it feels so hard. How can I trust Him when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Ruth dried her hands and stepped closer, placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Esther, courage doesn't mean you don't feel afraid. Courage means taking action even when you are afraid. Trusting God doesn't mean ignoring our problems, it means believing He is with us, even in the middle of the storm. And, sweetheart, you're far braver than you think." Esther hugged her tightly, and Ruth felt reassured that, despite the challenges, they were moving in the right direction. The next morning brought an unexpected moment. Esther was at her locker when one of the girls from the group she'd left behind approached her. It was Clara, a usually quiet girl who seemed different that day. "Can I talk to you?" Clara asked hesitantly. Esther nodded, surprised. "I saw what the others said about you," Clara began. "And, well, I just wanted to say I admire what you did. Walking away from that group isn't easy. They make it seem like you're nothing without them, but sometimes I think they're just as lost as everyone else." Clara's words struck a chord in Esther's heart. For the first time, someone recognized her decision as something brave and positive. Esther offered a small smile. "Thank you, Clara. I guess we're all just trying to figure out who we really are, huh?" Clara nodded, and the two began to talk. For the first time, Esther realized there might be others like her, searching for a truer path. That night, Esther shared the encounter with her mother. As Ruth listened, she felt a deep sense of gratitude and clarity. Esther's transformation was beginning to ripple outward, touching others. "That's God at work, Esther," Ruth said with a smile. "He's using your courage to reach other lives. And this is just the beginning." As Esther reflected on her mother's words while getting ready for bed, a spark of hope began to grow within her. Perhaps her mom was right, perhaps she could be a reflection of God's love, even in the midst of her struggles. But as Esther begins to find strength in her journey, Ruth receives unexpected news that could shake the fragile peace they've built. A shadow from the past threatens to resurface, bringing unresolved issues to light. Will mother and daughter be prepared to face this new challenge together, or will it test their faith and unity to the breaking point? A ghost from the past. It was a sunny afternoon when Ruth received a phone call that left her speechless. On the other end of the line was a voice she hadn't heard in years, delivering unexpected news. "Ruth, it's Marcos," said her late husband's brother, his voice tense. "I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Daniel's accident." Ruth felt her breath catch. The accident that had taken her husband Daniel's life was a wound she thought she'd learned to bear. But now, this unexpected call was reopening a pain that had lain dormant. "Marcos, what do you mean? What happened?" Ruth asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I can't explain over the phone. We need to talk in person. There's something you and Esther need to know." Reluctantly, Ruth agreed, though she had no idea what to expect. They arranged to meet at the church that evening, where they could speak privately. When Ruth told Esther about the call, her daughter grew concerned. Daniel was a distant memory for Esther, as she had been very young when he passed away. Still, she understood how his absence had shaped her mother's life, and, in many ways, her own. "Do you think it's something bad, Mom?" Esther asked. I don't know, sweetheart, Ruth replied, trying to hide her unease. But whatever it is, we'll face it together. Esther reached for her mother's hand, and Ruth felt a renewed sense of strength. Though the past was returning to haunt them, she knew they wouldn't face it alone. That evening, Ruth and Esther arrived at the church, where Marcos was already waiting. He looked tired, his face etched with lines of worry. After a tense greeting, they sat on a pew near the altar. "Ruth, I've been carrying this for a long time," Marcos began. "And I feel now is the right time to share the truth." "The truth about what?" Ruth asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Marcos took a deep breath before continuing. "About Daniel's accident. At the time, we all thought it was just a tragedy, a car malfunction. But it wasn't that simple. Recently, I discovered that Daniel was investigating something significant at work. He believed there were financial irregularities in his company. He told me he was gathering evidence to report it, but, just before he died, he confided that he felt someone was trying to silence him." Ruth felt frozen in place. Marcos's words swirled in her mind like a storm. "Are you saying the accident might not have been an accident?" she whispered, barely able to voice the thought. Marcos nodded solemnly. "I can't prove anything yet, but I found some of Daniel's old notes. He was close to uncovering something big." Esther, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Mom, do you think it's true? That someone hurt Dad on purpose?" Ruth felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked at Esther, so young and vulnerable, then at Marcos, whose eyes pleaded for understanding. "I don't know, Esther," Ruth replied, struggling to remain calm. "But if there's a way to honor your father's memory, it's by finding the truth." That night, as Ruth and Esther drove home, the silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Ruth knew Marcos's revelation was only the beginning of something far greater. And while delving into the past was painful, she felt it was necessary for her and Esther to find true peace. What will Daniel's notes reveal about the final days of his life? Ruth and Esther are about to embark on a dangerous journey to uncover the truth, but will they be ready for the answers they find? A notebook of secrets. Ruth barely slept that night. Marcos's words echoed in her mind, and a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, and hope, kept her awake. As dawn broke, she decided she couldn't wait any longer. If Daniel had left behind notes, she needed to see them. She called Marcos and arranged to meet at his house to examine the papers he had mentioned. Esther, still shaken by the revelations of the previous evening, insisted on accompanying her mother. "I want to know who my father really was, Mom. I want to understand what happened," she said, her voice firm despite her youth. Ruth knew Esther was right. If Daniel's past held answers, they would face it together. At Marcos's home, he greeted them with a worn cardboard box. Inside were folders filled with documents and a black notebook, its cover faded with age. "This was the notebook he used for personal notes," Marcos explained. "I found it hidden at the back of a drawer in his old office. I don't know what everything in here means, but maybe you can piece it together." Ruth carefully opened the notebook. Its pages were filled with Daniel's handwriting, notes, diagrams, and lists of names. There were entries detailing suspicious financial transactions and information about employees at his company. "Look, Mom," Esther said, pointing to a page. "He wrote something about someone named Paolo Antunes. It looks like he was the head of a department, and Dad thought he was embezzling money." Ruth read the note aloud. "Paolo Antunes is using fake accounts to hide embezzlement. I need solid proof before making a report. I can't let this go on." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. A lump formed in Ruth's throat. "He knew he was in danger," she whispered. "He was trying to protect something, or someone." Esther looked at her mother, her eyes filled with determination. "He was protecting us, wasn't he?" Ruth took her daughter's hand. "Yes, sweetheart. He always wanted the best for us." Back at home, Ruth felt the weight of the discovery settle heavily on her shoulders. The information in the notebook was clear but also perilous. If Paolo Antunes had indeed been involved in wrongdoing, uncovering the truth could put both Ruth and Esther at risk. "What do we do now, Mom?" Esther asked as she helped Ruth organize the papers from the notebook. "We pray, Esther," Ruth replied. "We need wisdom to know our next steps. And we need God's protection because I feel like we're stepping into something far bigger than we imagined." The two knelt together on the living room floor, and Ruth prayed fervently, her voice trembling with emotion. "Lord, we stand before a mystery only you can unravel. Guide us with your light, protect us, and show us the way. We don't want to act out of fear but with faith. We place everything in your hands." When they finished, Esther seemed calmer, but Ruth still felt a lingering unease. It was as if the notebook was a key to a door that, once opened, could never be closed. What else will Daniel's notebook reveal about the past? Ruth and Esther are now holding evidence that could expose dangerous truths, but will they have the courage and strength to confront what lies ahead? The next step could change their lives forever. Truths and consequences. The next morning brought a renewed sense of urgency. After a night of prayer and reflection, Ruth knew she couldn't ignore what she had uncovered. With Daniel's notebook in hand, she understood the need to involve someone who could help, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. Esther, ever by her side, offered a suggestion Ruth hadn't considered. "Mom, what if we talk to Pastor Elias? He always knows what to do, and maybe he knows someone who can investigate this without putting us in danger." Ruth hesitated for a moment but realized Esther was right. The pastor was a respected figure in the community with connections that might help without exposing the case too much. With the notebook tucked safely in her bag, Ruth and Esther headed to the church. In Pastor Elias's office, Ruth recounted everything: Marcos's call, the notebook, and Daniel's suspicions about Paolo Antunes. Pastor Elias listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Ruth, this is far bigger than anything we can handle on our own," he said, leafing through the notes. "But I know someone, a lawyer friend who specializes in cases like this. He's discreet and, most importantly, a man of God. I'll reach out to him and see how we can proceed." Ruth felt a momentary wave of relief, though the weight of responsibility still pressed on her. "Pastor, I'm scared. What if pursuing this puts Esther in danger?" she asked, clutching her daughter's hand. Elias looked at Ruth with compassion. "God calls us to face challenges with courage, Ruth. But he also gives us wisdom to act cautiously. Let's trust that he is in control, and we'll do everything to keep you and Esther safe." That afternoon, as Ruth and Esther returned home, they found an envelope slipped under their door. Ruth picked it up cautiously, a chill running down her spine. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief but menacing message. "Leave the past where it is. It's not worth it." Esther saw the alarm in her mother's face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Ruth tried to remain calm, but her voice wavered as she read the message aloud. "Someone knows what we're doing. And they're trying to scare us. Esther's heart raced. What are we going to do? Are we giving up? Ruth looked at her daughter, and something shifted inside her. Fear was present, but her faith burned brighter. She couldn't back down now, not after everything Daniel had sacrificed to protect his family. We're not giving up, Esther, Ruth said firmly. We're going to trust God and move forward. Your father fought for the truth, and now it's our turn. That evening, Ruth received a call from Pastor Elias. His lawyer friend had agreed to help and asked them to bring the notebook to his office the next day. Ruth felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Delivering the notebook would be a significant step, but also a point of no return. While Esther slept, Ruth stayed awake, holding her Bible and praying for strength. A verse came to her mind, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." 2 Timothy 1 verse 7. She clung to those words, knowing they were her most powerful weapon, faith. The following day, Ruth and Esther will set out to deliver the notebook to the lawyer, but unseen forces are determined to stop them from moving forward. Danger is closer than they realize. Will their faith be enough to overcome the trials that lie ahead? Pursued by the truth. The morning carried an unmistakable tension. Ruth and Esther were ready to deliver the notebook to the lawyer recommended by Pastor Elias. Before leaving, Ruth clasped her daughter's hands, and together they prayed aloud. Lord, we place this day in your hands. Guide our steps, protect us, and give us the courage to do what is right. Amen. As they stepped outside, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Walking to the bus stop, Ruth noticed something strange, a black car parked at the corner. It wasn't unusual to see cars there, but the driver appeared to be watching them. Ruth tried to brush off the thought, but her maternal instincts kept her on edge. Esther, stay close to me, she said, gripping her daughter's hand tightly. When the bus arrived, they boarded. Ruth watched through the window as they pulled away, and her heart sank as the black car began to follow them at a distance. Was she being paranoid, or was someone truly following them? When they reached downtown, Ruth spotted the car parked across the street. She couldn't ignore the danger any longer. Esther, walk quickly and don't look back, she instructed, trying to keep her voice steady. They hurried through the busy sidewalks, weaving through the crowd until they reached the building where the lawyer's office was located. Once inside, they headed straight to the designated floor. But even there, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The lawyer, a kind man named Dr. Alvaro, greeted them with a firm handshake. He exuded an air of trustworthiness, but Ruth's nerves remained frayed. "Thank you for helping us," Ruth said as she handed over the notebook. "My husband sacrificed so much to gather this information, and we need to make sure the truth comes out." Dr. Alvaro examined the notebook for a few minutes, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is incredibly detailed," he said. "If what's written here is verified, we're dealing with something very serious. I'll begin investigating immediately. However, Ruth, you and your daughter need to be cautious. These kinds of people don't like loose ends, and if Daniel was close to uncovering the truth, it's likely they're still keeping an eye on anyone who stirs the waters." His warning confirmed Ruth's fears. The black car, the threatening note, it all made sense. They were in danger. As Ruth and Esther left the building, Ruth scanned the area for the car. She didn't see it, but her anxiety remained. Deciding it was unsafe to return home immediately, they headed to the church, where they felt secure under Pastor Elias's watchful care. "We'll pray and wait," the pastor said after hearing about the car. God is our refuge and strength, even when the enemy surrounds us. Ruth and Esther spent the rest of the day at the church. That evening, they returned home with Marcos, who insisted on escorting them for their safety. In the stillness of the night, Ruth awoke to the sound of movement outside. Peering through the window, she saw the black car parked on the street again. This time, there was no mistaking it, they were being watched. Fear rose within her, but she clung to the scripture that had carried her through many sleepless nights. Fear not, for I am with you, be not dismayed, for I am your God. Isaiah 41 verse 10. Ruth took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and prayed silently. She knew the battle was far from over, but she also knew their strength came from God. With the notebook now in the lawyer's hands and a visible threat shadowing them, Ruth and Esther find themselves entering an even more perilous chapter of their journey. How far will those who wish to suppress the truth go to silence them? And will Ruth's faith be enough to shield her family and see them through the storm? Night of decision. The black car remained parked outside the house. Ruth stood by the living room window, watching every movement with sharp attention. Her heart pounded, but her faith stayed firm. She knew retreating wasn't an option, even as fear whispered otherwise. Esther appeared beside her, a blanket draped over her shoulders and fatigue evident on her face. "Do you think they'll try to hurt us, Mom?" Esther asked hesitantly. Ruth knelt, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "I don't know what they're planning, sweetheart, but I know one thing, God is with us. He will protect us, no matter what happens." She spoke the words with conviction, though Ruth understood that faith would need to be paired with action. The next morning, Ruth called Pastor Elias and explained the situation. He wasted no time offering practical help. "You can come to the church and stay here for a few days," he suggested. "It'll be safer, and we can arrange for someone to watch the house." Ruth agreed. She wasn't willing to risk Esther's safety by staying in such a vulnerable spot. Gathering a few clothes and important documents, they left as discreetly as possible and headed to the church, where Pastor Elias welcomed them warmly. While Esther rested, Ruth sat down with Elias and Marcos to discuss their next steps. "Has Dr. Alvaro said anything about what he plans to do with the information?" Marcos asked. "He's investigating," Ruth replied. "He said he's working on gathering enough evidence to bring this to the authorities. But he also warned us that we're being watched." Marcos nodded grimly. "These people won't give up easily. If Daniel was close to exposing them, they know what you have is dangerous to them." Elias's voice cut through the tension, calm and steady. "That's why we must strengthen our prayers. This isn't just a physical battle, Ruth. It's spiritual. Let's ask God for wisdom at every step and for him to confuse the plans of those who seek harm." That night, as Ruth and Esther tried to sleep in one of the church's guest rooms, a noise outside startled them awake. Instinctively, Ruth grabbed her phone and moved to the window. Peering out, she saw the black car parked again, this time across the street. Her heart raced, but she fought to stay calm. She called Pastor Elias, who quickly arrived at their room. "They're outside," Ruth said, pointing to the car. Elias looked out the window and motioned for Ruth to step back. "I'm calling the police," he said firmly. "We shouldn't face this alone." As they waited, Ruth and Esther knelt together, praying fervently. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, but prayer reminded them that God was greater than any threat. "Lord, we place this in your hands," Ruth prayed, her voice trembling. "Protect us, confuse our enemies, and show us what to do." Minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed through the street, and the black car sped away. When the police arrived, Ruth explained the situation, but the officers were unable to track the vehicle. "We'll patrol the area tonight," one of the officers assured them. "If you notice anything suspicious, contact us immediately." The car may have fled, but the threat lingered. Ruth and Esther felt as though they were being pushed toward an inevitable confrontation, one where their courage and faith would be tested to the limit. Are they prepared to face what's coming? And will their trust in God be enough to carry them through the storm that looms closer with each passing moment? The unexpected confrontation. The days that followed were filled with tension and constant prayer. Ruth and Esther remained at the church, where they felt safer under the care of Pastor Elias and the congregation. Still, Ruth knew they couldn't hide forever. The notebook was in safe hands, but the weight of the truths it contained loomed over them like a shadow. One morning, as Ruth helped organize the church's community kitchen, her phone rang. It was Dr. Alvaro. "Ruth, I've uncovered some important information," he said, his voice steady. "The evidence in the notebook is damning. Paolo Antoni's embezzled millions through fake accounts and fraudulent contracts. I'm already in contact with the authorities, but we need to proceed cautiously. This exposure will have significant consequences, and it's likely the people involved will retaliate." Ruth swallowed hard. She knew they were doing the right thing, but the threat felt more real than ever. "What can I do to help?" she asked, though her heart was heavy. "Stay vigilant and stay safe," Alvaro replied. "And inform me immediately if anything unusual happens. We're close to finishing this." Ruth thanked him and ended the call. As she put the phone away, she noticed Esther watching her from across the room. "They've found something, haven't they?" Esther asked, stepping closer. Ruth nodded and pulled her daughter into an embrace. "Yes, sweetheart. We're close to revealing everything. But that means we need to be even more careful." Esther squeezed her mother's hand tightly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The turning point. That evening, Ruth and Esther were in the church's main hall, helping prepare for a prayer event. The bustling activity and spiritual atmosphere were comforting. But Ruth noticed something odd. A man she didn't recognize had entered the hall, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone. He was tall and wore a suit that seemed out of place at such a modest gathering. A chill ran down Ruth's spine as he began walking directly toward her. "Mrs. Ruth?" the man asked, his voice low and firm. Ruth hesitated before answering. "Yes, that's me." "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter," he replied. "I'm here to give you a warning. Stop what you're doing. You're putting yourself, and your daughter, in danger. There are forces at play far beyond what you understand. Walk away from this before something worse happens." Ruth's blood ran cold, but she held her ground. Before she could respond, Pastor Elias approached, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Elias asked with authority. The man glanced at the pastor and, without another word, turned and left the hall. Ruth felt her legs weaken, but Elias steadied her. "Who was that man, Ruth?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "He came to threaten me," Ruth replied, her voice trembling. "He told me to stop, that we're in danger." Esther, who had been watching from a distance, ran over to her mother. "Mom, are you okay? What happened?" Ruth took her daughter's hands and looked into her eyes. "Esther, no matter what happens, we will trust in God. He is our fortress." The next step. That night, Ruth and Esther prayed together once more, asking for protection and guidance. Ruth knew she was dealing with something far larger than she'd anticipated, but she also knew there was no turning back. Shortly before bed, Ruth's phone rang again. It was Dr. Alvaro. "Ruth, something has happened. The information has been leaked, and the police are already taking action. But there's a problem, Paulo Antunes has disappeared." Ruth felt the weight of his words. If Paulo was on the run, the danger to her and Esther could escalate. "What should we do?" she asked, trying to mask her panic. "Stay safe, Ruth. Justice is on its way, but it's possible he might try to silence you before he's caught. I'll keep you updated." With Paulo Antunes on the loose and the net closing in, Ruth and Esther faced the growing fear of an imminent confrontation. But when danger finally comes knocking, will their faith be enough to see them through? Danger knocks at the door. The news of Paulo Antunes's disappearance heightened Ruth and Esther's vigilance. Despite the growing fear, their trust in God remained unshaken. Ruth knew that every step they had taken was guided by faith and truth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that a confrontation was imminent. That morning, Ruth felt a pressing need to strengthen their prayers. Esther, moved by her mother's resolve, joined her at the small improvised altar in the church room. Together, they prayed fervently. "Lord, you are our rock and shield," Ruth pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. "We know the enemy seeks to shake us, but we trust you will protect us. Let truth prevail, and let justice be done." Esther, her eyes brimming with tears, added her simple but heartfelt words. "God, we're scared, but we want to be strong. Please stay with us." Her daughter's prayer touched Ruth deeply. Esther's newfound faith was a source of strength, and it bolstered Ruth's resolve. The night visitor. Close to midnight, Ruth was startled awake by an unusual sound. It was faint, like someone trying to open the church's main door. Her heart raced. Quietly, she grabbed her phone and stepped into the hallway. Through a window, she saw a hooded figure at the entrance. "Esther, wake up," Ruth whispered urgently as she returned to their room. Esther woke with a start, and Ruth quickly explained what she had seen. Together, they called Pastor Elias, who was sleeping in a room at the back of the church. Within minutes, Elias arrived with Marcos, both armed with flashlights and a firm determination to protect Ruth and Esther. "Stay here and lock the door," Elias instructed. "We'll check it out." Ruth and Esther obeyed, clutching each other tightly as they listened to the cautious footsteps of Elias and Marcos. A few minutes later, the men returned with grim expressions. "Whoever it was got away before we could reach them," Marcos said. "But they left this." He held up a crumpled piece of paper found near the door. Elias unfolded it and read the message aloud. "The truth may cost more than you're willing to pay. Walk away while you can." Ruth's chest tightened. The message was clear: whoever was behind this knew exactly where they were. Preparing for the confrontation. The next morning, Ruth called Dr. Alvaro to inform him about the incident. The lawyer didn't mince words. "Ruth, you need protection. I'll contact the local authorities to ensure security for you and Esther. We can't underestimate what these people are capable of." Ruth agreed but knew her greatest protection came from God. As the day wore on, the feeling that something significant was about to happen grew stronger. Pastor Elias, ever vigilant, organized a special prayer meeting with the congregation, asking God to intervene on Ruth and Esther's behalf. "Lord, confuse the plans of the wicked," Elias prayed fervently. "Let your justice prevail and protect these women with your power." The decisive night. That evening, Ruth and Esther decided to sleep in the church's main hall, surrounded by members of the congregation. The peaceful atmosphere provided some comfort, but Ruth couldn't bring herself to rest. She felt an undeniable sense of foreboding. Shortly after midnight, the screech of tires broke the silence. Ruth rushed to a window and saw a black car, similar to the one that had followed them, stop abruptly in front of the church. Two men exited the vehicle, one wielding what looked like a crowbar. "They're here!" Ruth shouted, waking everyone in the hall. Pastor Elias quickly took charge, urging everyone to stay calm while another member of the church called the police. Ruth and Esther clung to each other, their eyes filled with both fear and resolve. The men outside began pounding violently on the door, trying to break in. The sound echoed through the hall, but before they could force their way inside, the blare of police sirens filled the street. The intruders ran back to their car and sped off, but not before being seen by the arriving officers. The attempted break-in left Ruth and Esther shaken, but the timely arrival of the police ensured their immediate safety. For now, they had evaded the danger, but the looming question remained. How far are the enemies of truth willing to go to silence them? And will Ruth and Esther find the strength to face what could be their greatest trial yet? The strength of truth. The next day dawned with a mix of relief and unease. The attempted break-in at the church had left Ruth and Esther shaken, but the police presence brought a temporary sense of security. Still, Ruth knew the danger hadn't completely passed. As she sat in the church's main hall eating breakfast, her mind replayed the events of the previous night. "Mom, do you think they'll come back?" Esther asked, breaking the silence. Ruth clasped her daughter's hand firmly. "Maybe, Esther. But we're in God's hands. They may try to intimidate us, but the truth is stronger than any threat." Moments later, Pastor Elias arrived with urgent news. "Ruth, I just received a call from Dr. Alvaro. He needs you to come to his office as soon as possible. The police have captured Paulo Antunes." The words echoed through the hall, filling Ruth with a mix of hope and sudden nervousness. "They've captured him?" "He's in custody," she asked, her voice quick with anticipation. Elias nodded. "Yes, and he's starting to talk. But Alvaro needs you to confirm some details from the notebook to finalize the case." Ruth felt a wave of relief tempered with apprehension. Going to the office meant facing more risks, but it was an opportunity to bring their fight for truth to an end. The path to justice. Hours later, Ruth and Esther arrived at Dr. Alvaro's office, escorted by the police. The lawyer greeted them with a reassuring smile that brought a small measure of calm. "Ruth, what you and Esther have done so far has been crucial," he began. "The notebook contains enough evidence to take this case to trial. Paulo Antunes is cooperating because he knows he can't escape. But there's one final piece we need to tie everything together, and you can help us." Alvaro explained that Paulo had confessed to the embezzlement scheme and implicated others in the company. However, he continued to insist that Daniel's death was a tragic coincidence. Hearing this, Ruth felt a surge of anger and sadness. Coincidence? He was being threatened. He knew something was wrong. Ruth said firmly. Alvaro nodded. "We believe you, Ruth. That's why we need your help to connect the threats to the accident. We're on the brink of justice, and we won't stop now." The revelation. As they talked, a police officer entered the room with unexpected news. "We've found evidence in Paulo Antunes's car that corroborates what's in the notebook," he said. "There are records of messages sent to Daniel weeks before his death, demanding that he stop investigating. Additionally, we found photographs and notes indicating that Ruth and Esther have been under surveillance recently. Ruth's stomach churned. Knowing she and Esther had been monitored was terrifying, but it also validated that their fight wasn't in vain. "This proves they knew everything," Alvaro said, a determined glint in his eyes. "Now we have the final pieces to ensure justice is served." Ruth felt a surge of emotions but stayed composed. She squeezed Esther's hand and whispered, "We're almost there, sweetheart. Almost there." The final testimony. A few days later, Ruth was called to testify at a preliminary hearing. Seated before the judge, with Esther watching from the gallery, she recounted everything she knew, from Daniel's notes to the recent threats against her family. Her voice was steady, but emotion underpinned every word. "My husband was a just and courageous man," Ruth said, looking directly at Paulo Antunes, who sat at the defendant's table. "He sacrificed his safety because he believed the truth needed to be told. And I will not let his memory be forgotten." When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Ruth felt the weight of responsibility begin to lift. She had done her part. Justice on the horizon. With the evidence presented and Ruth's testimony solidifying the case, the scales of justice appeared to be tipping in favor of the truth. But questions linger. Will Paulo Antunes and the others involved finally pay for their crimes? And how will Ruth and Esther rebuild their lives after this chapter of struggle and resilience? The weight of justice. The days following the hearing were marked by nearly unbearable anxiety. Ruth and Esther waited for news of the judge's decision while trying to resume some semblance of normalcy, still sheltered at the church. Despite the tension, a sense of peace began to settle, as if the burden they had carried was finally being lifted. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Esther asked one evening as the two rested in their small church room. Ruth smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "He'd be more than proud, Esther. He gave everything to protect you and fight for the truth. And now, in a way, we're finishing what he started." Esther hugged her mother tightly, and in that moment, Ruth felt that regardless of what happened next, they had already won the greatest battle, keeping their faith and family intact. The verdict. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Ruth and Esther went to the courthouse accompanied by Pastor Elias and members of the church who had rallied around them in support. The atmosphere was heavy, but Ruth held her head high, knowing they had done all they could. The judge read the detailed findings, Daniel's notebook, the records found in Paulo Antunes's car, and the testimonies of Ruth and others involved. When it came time to deliver the sentence, the room fell silent. Paulo Antunes and his accomplices are found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and witness intimidation, the judge declared. Furthermore, the evidence indicates that the accident that claimed Daniel's life was deliberately caused, constituting involuntary manslaughter. "I sentence the defendants to the maximum penalty under the law." The words reverberated through the room, and Ruth felt tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of vengeance, but of justice. At last, the truth had prevailed. Esther squeezed her mother's hand, her voice trembling with emotion. "We did it, Mom. Dad can rest in peace now." Ruth embraced her daughter tightly, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her. In her heart, she knew this moment was a direct answer to their prayers and the unshakable faith that had carried them through. A new beginning. In the days that followed, Ruth and Esther began rebuilding their lives. The church remained a pillar of support, and the community, inspired by their story, became more united than ever. Ruth decided it was time to give new purpose to Daniel's legacy. With the help of Marcos and Pastor Elias, she started a community project to teach families the values of integrity and justice. Esther, in turn, found a new passion, helping other young people navigate life's challenges and discover their faith. The bond between mother and daughter grew stronger than ever, and Ruth finally felt they were on the path God had planned for them. "Mom, do you think all of this happened for a reason?" Esther asked one afternoon as they walked through the grove they both loved. Ruth paused, looking at her daughter as the sunlight filtered through the trees. "Yes, sweetheart. God never wastes an experience. Everything we went through was meant to strengthen us and draw us closer to Him. And now, we can use our story to help others." Esther smiled and took her mother's hand. "Then let's do it together." As Ruth and Esther moved toward their future, a new challenge awaited them. Someone from Ruth's past was about to resurface, bringing unanswered questions and a new opportunity to prove that with faith, courage, and love, nothing is impossible. And you, have you ever faced a situation where you had to rely completely on God for strength? Share your experience in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. This is Stories That Embrace. Stay with God, and we'll see you in the next story.